And we touched on this in the context of what's the world going to look like in 2050. Remco, it sort of hit me with these stats. We said, look, we've got to add this to the podcast because it's such an interesting dynamic. India basically has got 65 wide bodies. Kaboom. What do you do with all that?
And even
that
Indonesia has 300 million people. It has a GDP per capita that's higher than India. So the demand for aircraft is tremendous. I mean, the backlog that Airbus has is like 8,000 aircraft. Boeing has close to 6,000. A lot of them narrow bodies. But to connect basically these developing economies, there's no flights between Brazil and Nigeria. There's no flights. There's only 42 flights allowed under the air service agreement between India and China, which is, how is that even possible?
Welcome to the Success Consultancy's Just Great People podcast, the podcast that introduces you to ordinary people who've done extraordinary things. My name is Barry Eustance, and I'd like to introduce you to today's guest. Hi, everybody. It's Barry Eustance here from the Success Consultancy's Just Great People podcast. I'm delighted to welcome Remco Althuis today. Remco's got a most extraordinary story to tell about his journey through KLM, joint ventures with China Southern, Etihad, Air Seychelles, Nordic, real airline story, and one that I'm sure you'll find fascinating. I know that the airline industry, flying airplanes, is of great interest to a lot of people. So Remco, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us on the Just Great People podcast.
Thank you. Good morning, Barry. Thank you very much for having me.
Tell me, Remco and I met very recently, actually, and we had this wonderful conversation, very free-flowing conversation about Remco's career. So, Remco, for our dear listener and viewer, could you just take us through how your career progressed from KLM and through the various iterations that followed thereafter?
I took my first flight on TWA when I flew to the United States for an exchange student year in 1987. On a Lockheed TriStar. I think I was kind of hooked. So when I finished high school and then started studying at Leiden University in the west of the Netherlands, I saw an ad for KLM who needed part-time workers. So I joined KLM as a baggage handler, part-time, but I was still studying, loading bags and going on the ramp with the aircraft and that kind of exciting stuff. Because I majored in Mandarin and Asia Studies Chinese, all right. I was working on the KLM's flight to Taipei at the time because they hadn't opened China yet, doing the boarding calls for those flights in Mandarin. After I graduated, e-ticketing had just been introduced and they needed somebody to help with the automation of the ground handling process. So I was the guy who wrote the first business rules for KLM's first self-service check-in application. I was having a conversation and they were asking, well, what would you like to do? I said, well, I know how to speak Mandarin. I'd like to go to China. And so I first worked for a while at the Europe region. So the then senior vice president of the Europe region took me under his wings for a while, learned basically the tricks of the trade. And then very shortly thereafter, I was asked to go to China to help set up Chengdu, Sichuan, because this was at the early days.
That's quite an early frontier kind of posting, isn't it? Really, given where China was at that stage and the relationships with China. Interesting to see that you share the same kind of provenance as Freddie Mercury of Queen, who also started off as a baggage loader. It seems to be sort of rite of passage for people who go on to greatness. So there we are, Chengdu. What then happened, Remco?
After Chengdu, so we had the Go West strategy in China. So there were incentives to launch routes outside Shanghai and Beijing. So KLM was one of the first ones to launch Chengdu. I helped the team set up the shop. I was then asked to move to Guangzhou to help with the joint venture that KLM just signed with China Southern in Guangzhou, which was wildly interesting. I learned a tremendous amount about engaging with different cultures.
We discussed this the other day, the importance of cultural integration and integrating two quite diverse cultures into organizations and operations. I mean, how is that achieved at the operational level? How do you actually make that happen? because it's something that people get wrong a lot of the time. What's the secret? What are the go-to items that need to be considered?
I think obviously it is respect, trying to understand the angle of where the other party is coming from. I mean, in this specific case, KLM, because of its cooperation with Northwest, which dated back from, I think, the late 80s, had a lot more experience in joint venture management than the other side. So there was an interest in sharing knowledge. So they wanted to learn, but of course you can't tell them what to do or dictate. There's always, you have to talk less, listen more, and then see if you can find common ground, which ultimately is trying to create a win-win. So come up with a winning proposal for both sides, that both aircraft are filled with passengers, not just your own metal. And then try to find ways to really do the business development. So,
talk less and listen more, I think, is a great sort of thing for people to remember generally. I should do it myself, actually, to be honest. And continuing from there, then, there were lots of occasions during your career where cultural integration and the respect for different cultures was going to be important as you progressed.
So I did that for 3 years, and then was asked to lead the Eastern China region based in Shanghai for Air France and KLM at the time, because the cooperation had then intensified and the sales offices were integrated. Also there, did a few more route launches in Hangzhou, China, and Xiamen. And I think here is also very important that you understand the framework in which you operate. So there's a lot of government officials involved, and so that means you have to go talk to people, sit down, talk them through, and they're all eager to engage and to learn and celebrate basically the new routes. Lots of banquets, lots of motai, baijiu, and so quite a bit of drinking as well every now and then. But just engaging with people, and because you need everybody, all the stakeholders, to ensure that such a route launch is a success. Airports and civil aviation authorities and local authorities to make that work. So lots of visits going there. Yes.
And getting buy-in, I would imagine,
yes,
cross-culturally is actually quite a significant art.
Understanding
the
market
must have helped.
Understanding the market. What is the reason for these people wanting to travel? Where do they go? And working with head office to ensure that those routes, the flows could be optimized. Those kind of things.
And then making a route profitable and an airline profitable is an interesting concept, because it seems to be almost universally impossible. Remco, as you were progressing along this journey, did you glean from profitability in terms of airlines, how they operate, what makes an airline great and what makes an airline not so great is I think quite a small margin, isn't it, in terms of operations? What was your experience and the insights that you gained and you could sort of convey that you gleaned from this?
Well, I think if you're in the sales organization, you're responsible for kind of the revenue generating. So that means that when a new route is launched, it's first about kind of filling it up, and then when you have created enough demand, ensure that your positioning and your segmentation is right, so that your bookings still keep coming. If the flight is already 60% full, I mean, getting the base load in, which is usually group work, tour groups to China, takes a bit of work, but it's relatively straightforward. But then ensuring that you find other pockets of revenue, and then ensuring that the revenue management demand forecast is set in such a way that you know that these customers keep coming, so that you build up on the revenue base, is crucially important. Because filling it up is easy, but making it profitable is a lot harder.
It's the hardest bit, which again is something that's demonstrated in the P&Ls of many airlines, that it's not just about filling seats, it's actually making profitable. And revenue management you hit upon there. And I should emphasize here, Remco went on to become VP and CEO of Airlines, and we'll discuss those later. But I was keen to get into some of the meat of the airline industry itself. Revenue management, how easy is it to get that wrong?
It's quite easy to get it wrong, in the sense that you, like I said, it is a trade. It's a craft. So you have to understand the dynamics of the market, setting up the demand forecast correct. So knowing, Availability opens up generally 51 weeks before departure. So the first seats can start to be sold 51 weeks. And you don't want to be sold out with 10 months to go, because then you know you did it wrong. And so basically in the booking curve, which usually becomes steeper closer to departure, you still have to have space. And it means that you have to understand which segments of the market book at which phase in the booking curve. And it takes a lot of data crunching and analysis, working with historic flight patterns and trying to find proxies for flights with similar flows. And sometimes even within a country, you can get that very wrong. I mean, the Beijing market with all of the state-owned enterprise traffic is very different from the Shanghai market in booking behavior. And so if you don't understand it, then being full too soon is problematic, because you're foregoing a lot of revenue. That also means sometimes holding your nerves and waiting it out a little bit. And I think what's also crucially important is understanding and making your head office understand where in your local market the peaks are. I mean, in China or countries that celebrate lunar calendar, obviously have a very different demand pattern than countries that have Christmas or when the summer peaks are. Even with the Middle Eastern carriers, Ramadan travels through the year. It's not adjusted for specific date and time, so that changes every year, and you have to know and understand what will happen then.
And again, back to revenue management, do you find that there are airlines who actually implement revenue management without fully understanding how the system operates, and therefore they don't optimize and they leave loads of money on the table? Do you think happens a lot?
I think you can see that. For instance, a company like Etihad has learned a tremendous amount. So I think under the leadership of the current commercial team, you can see from the figures that the seat factors have greatly improved. When I was working there, basically 79-80% was a good figure, and I think they reported for last year they're at 87, which means that they have done a tremendous amount of work and using analysis tools to understand and how they can fill it up more. And of course, we all know the high cost of running an airline. So the profit starts to kick in once you hit 75. I mean, it sounds crazy, but for a lot of airlines, the first 75-80% of the seat factor, you're breaking even. You're not making any money. So you need to reach a higher figure. And of course, airlines that are the most profitable ones are the ones that consistently hit high numbers. And for a network carrier, that is somewhere, let's say, high 80s. That's what 89. If you're 90, it's doing really well. And for low-cost airlines like Ryanair, 95-96% of your seats need to be sold.
Yeah, and they do.
And they do. Yeah, they do. Yeah. So they hit 95. And what I always find interesting is that given the amount of seats that the industry produces, the industry boards about, I think last year, a little bit over 4 billion people. So there's still 1 billion unsold seats in the whole system. That's why people love working for airlines so much, because they can try to get a seat.
Staff travel.
For staff travel. 1 billion. That's a tremendous amount.
Yeah, to leave on the table. And you were the VP Vice President for Europe for Etihad.
Yeah.
So you're speaking with sort of considerable authority on the subject. If airlines fail to, because I'm sure there'll be plenty of airline listeners to the podcast, if airlines fail to sort of really optimize their revenue management system, is that really the difference between profit or loss? Do you think is it that fine a balance?
Airlines spend 28% on fuel, roughly, depending, and that's pretty much the same for everyone. So the fuel costs are the fuel cost. I think aircraft leases are aircraft leases, meaning that it's not like one gets a 777 for 100K and another one for 900K. No, it's a market rate. It's pretty consistent. So a lot of the cost elements for airlines are the same. Obviously, there's there is a scale in there, meaning that the more aircraft you have, the better coverage you have for your overhead. And so that clearly plays a role. But I think generally speaking, it is such it's a low margin industry. So getting your revenue right and getting your cost under control are kind of the two things that you need to do to be profitable and successful and sustainable. Because otherwise, you just keep making losses, which need to be taken up or taken care of by the shareholder.
Yeah, and you're suggesting, I think, that quite a lot of that that money that's left on the table can be resolved through effective and optimized revenue management.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because what people forget is that even for smaller airlines, basically the amount of seats produced goes up very quickly. If you have one A320neo with 180 seats, and if you plan it well, you do 8 turns a day, 1,300 seats per day, of which you would want to sell 85% every day.
Every day.
Obviously throughout the year, we know also in Northern Hemisphere, February is not as strong as July, but on an average, you would want to sell as many as you can every day. And so that takes quite a bit of effort. And then obviously it's a different story if it's a point-to-point, a low-cost proposition versus kind of a network connectivity or hub structure, so that you sell connections. That makes it slightly more complicated. But you want to sell, and so you have to understand your market, and you have to understand your pricing. You have to understand your demand curve very well in order to be able to achieve that seat factor. And obviously, the bigger your network is, ultimately, the easier it becomes with every addition to that network. And so if you think of a network carrier, let's take Emirates, for instance, and they have a bank of arrivals. So it's 50 planes unloading 400 people. So that's 20,000 people coming out of aircraft. A lot of them stay in Dubai, but a lot of them stay in the airport and then connect onto another aircraft. But if they just add one A380, that's 500 seats, but they have a lot of options to sell through the connectivity. So basically the market that aircraft originates from, Bucharest, as an example, has a lot more options to sell from a network point of view, because if the Romanian market sells one seat to each of those destinations, it's a lot easier to fill up that aircraft than it would be for only one destination. So in the beginning, it's always a lot harder because you have very limited portfolio to sell. That's also why airlines code-share. So you basically extend your network, but mostly your distribution, your sales capabilities.
And presumably also your ancillary sales are vitally important. I mean, I should imagine for Emirates and the big carriers, and also Ryanair. And we were discussing this for cruise ships, weren't we? That the cruise industry, the kind of the onboard sales account for around about 50% of their revenue. And the same for airlines, isn't it? But the low cost carriers such as Ryanair. Yes. And presumably also for Dubai itself, the fact that you've got so many people transiting through the airport, it's no coincidence it's got the world's best duty-free shop, allegedly.
Absolutely. I mean, that's how airports make money. Yeah? So that's also how they are incentivized, how they incentivized operators to come. Because they know if you have in the morning, Ryanair has 4 departures at 7 a.m., and that is 4 times 180, 750 people. If they all buy a bagel and a Coke in the shop and they need to park their cars and what have you, that's interesting for an airport. That's how they make money, through concessions and through parking fees. Obviously, in addition to some of the landing fees, but at new airports or smaller airports that Ryanair operates, and they're eager to have that business in, and they're willing to offer incentives for them to come. Ryanair is not at Heathrow because, there's no slots there, but also because the model wouldn't work because the departure taxes are so high that they can't create the demand that from Heathrow. There would be demand for sure, but the pricing would have to be very, very different because of the, the entry level fixed cost of departing from that specific airport.
And the airport concessions are very important to Ryanair, aren't they? And Ryanair brings us on to another feature of the economics of airline operation, and that is simplicity. Yeah. The importance of simplicity, particularly for small and aspiring carriers. And could you take us through your experience with that at Remco and your thoughts on simplicity? Because this does filter through to other operations outside of the airline industry, the importance of revenue management and the importance of simplicity.
I think, simplicity is in aviation is achieved through, say, fleet choice. So you don't want to make it too complicated by operating too many different fleet types, particularly if the numbers per subtype are very, very small. In the case of Air Seychelles, for instance, Air Seychelles operated A330 services to Europe. Operating an A330, it's about $8,000 depending on the fuel price per flight hour. And the fuel goes up, then the flight goes up to $9,000. So that means that on a 10-hour flight, you have to make $90,000 one way in revenue every single flight, not only the flight before Christmas or before the Easter holidays or and summer peak. Every day. That's very hard to do. So I think that it is crucial for the survival of a company to look at, well, can we really afford to do this? And if the answer is no, you should get rid of it. Say, well, we can't afford it. We have to cut this network and leave it to somebody else. And so at Air Seychelles, we reduced the complexity by saying goodbye to a specific fleet type and then modernizing A320 CEOs to NEOs, and then finding routes that could sustainably make a bit of profit, so that the airline, which is crucial for the connectivity of that very isolated country, could survive on the long term. It doesn't have to make money every year, but on a 5 to 7 year cycle, it doesn't cost the taxpayers any money. That yields some return. And if you do it well and you have a good year, basically from a demand point of view, meaning that the overall aviation economics are good, then you can be profitable. And
I should point out the ever modest Remco was also the chief executive officer, CEO of Air Seychelles.
There it was really the deliberate choice. So the shareholders said, it's a state-owned company. We want to keep this airline because we want to stay in control of the connectivity. And if you have a diversified business, meaning, okay, you have regional connectivity, which the NEO can bring because it can fly very far. It can fly 6 hours. We launched Tel Aviv, which from Seychelles is a 6-hour flight with a full load. And then you have a domestic network where basically you say we have local demands, public service obligation type traffic, and then also international connecting traffic, and then a ground handling business that generates good revenue to basically keep the company sustainable. But at least you're in control of your own connectivity. If everything happens, we're coming up on the 5th anniversary of COVID, and I vividly remember there everything stopping. So I was in Seychelles end of March 5 years ago, and all of the other operators had stopped. So then the airline doesn't have any connectivity. And then Air Seychelles could bring that connectivity, which was needed, because you still they need tourism, but they also need crucial...
Well, a nation state, haven't you? An island nation state.
Yeah, they have a big tuna fleet there. And so one of the charters that we organized was to get deckhands from Western Africa and tuna captains from France and Spain with a stop, because it was the only way to get them there. And they worked far too long, and they needed to be exchanged to keep the economy going.
Absolutely. And we were discussing also the Airbus XLR and how that might significantly change some of the airline economics and dynamics. What are your thoughts on that, Remco?
I think, it's a fantastic aircraft. I think it has massive potential. Interestingly, I just saw an article when people are asked, because I think Wizz Air is going to launch Gatwick to Abu Dhabi. I think they've launched also some flights to Saudi. And of course, when people are asked, would you get on an aircraft for 7 hours? Everybody says no. On a narrow body for 7 hours. I very strongly believe there's always demand for a good product proposition, good price. And you can already see that the likes of JetBlue now are encroaching upon the European market with LRs. So they basically have the long-range A320s. They already fly to Amsterdam and Paris and Gatwick and I think Dublin, and they're coming into Edinburgh, I think. And the XLR would basically allow them to even go to Prague and Rome, and why not?
Yeah, and long, thin routes seem absolutely perfect with very low economic.
Well, you don't have the pressure of having to sell 300 seats. So, looking back or just giving that example of Air Seychelles, if you need to cover $200K round trip in revenue every single day, that means that you have to sell 250 flights at €400 one way every day. And that's a lot easier if it's an XLR. You only have 160 people in a two-class configuration.
And you're making money.
And you make money because, A330, 8 crew, A320, 4 cabin crew, and of course, two cockpit crew. But that makes a big difference.
Yeah. And Remco, I'm going to put you on the spot now. Relax, it'll be easy. As role as CEO, you've been through the airline business in manner of roles. You've seen it all. If you were to try and summarize airline economics, how to make a profit in the airline industry, I did tell you this was going to be an easy question. What's your formula? What's the formula, the Remco Althuis formula for making a profit out of an airline? What are the key factors to consider?
Well, you have to understand your cost. So it depends really where you are. The easy answer is if you're very dominant in your market and the barriers to entry for competitors are very high because you have 85% of the slots at your departure airport, it already becomes a lot easier. But that takes a while, right? That's not gonna happen. But no, at the start it is scalable business. Yeah? So, but it requires a minimum set because obviously we safety first, right? So the first people that you need to set up an AOC, an air operating certificate, that you have to start years in advance, or depending on your civil aviation authority, you need to have, and let's assume that's 25 people, right? So you have to pay 25 people for quite a bit of time to get your AOC up, and you're not making any money. But then once you scale it up, you can still use a lot of the original. You don't really need to basically say, well, with every aircraft that I add, I also need to add 25 people in my head office. That's not how it works, right? So you have to start, think slow, understand your market, keep your cost under control, keep it very simple, meaning stick with a fleet type that you understand and that serves your main market flows, and then scale it up.
And keeping that fleet choice simple, as far as possible to one aircraft type, isn't it?
Yeah, I think, if you look at the main operators, they can afford to have both Airbus and Boeing wide bodies. And it's also given kind of the fact that these are very complicated engineered machines. If you had an all Airbus fleet and something were to happen with an Airbus somewhere in the world, you would have to ground all of them. Not good. So you can, if you can afford it, these are the big ones, like Delta, American, and KLM.
You just roll out of Boeing.
Yeah. You can at least rely on the other guy for a while. That's also why the Middle East carriers, Emirates has 777s and A380s, and Etihad has A350s and 777s and the 78s. So to diversify their risk. But people say, well, the 737 doesn't work on this city pair. That's why we also need Embraers, and that's why we also need ATRs. And that's the thing. That's when the problems start, especially if you don't have the scale. Now, one of the previous CEOs at KLM I worked for, I think once told me, say, if it's below 10 on a single aircraft type, don't bother, because then you're just doing it to show off. So you have to have scale in one aircraft type. The higher the scale, the better. Case in point, Ryanair, it's all 737-800s that are all moving to Maxes.
And a very strong balance sheet.
Very strong,
as a result.
Yeah. And Southwest is the same. I think it is really your positioning. If you're class leader, which I think Ryanair mostly is, then you can build on a very profitable business model. If you make it too complicated, so if you look at Southwest, for instance, they started as low cost, but they also started to through check baggage, for instance, which I think on Ryanair you still can't do. If you take 2 Ryanair flights, you have to get your bags, go up again, check in again, and then take your next one. So if you have a hub like Amsterdam, you have a massive arrival peak, so a very high concentration of effort when things arrive in a 90-minute window, and then departures, And when all the aircraft are gone again, then you can relax a bit. So that also means that you need the staffing for the peak, because that's when you need most of your resources there. Because everything needs to be, the aircraft needs to be cleaned, needs to be fueled. All the
and it also compromises turnaround time, obviously, for a low-cost operator.
Yeah. You don't want to optimize basically. You don't want to activity in that sense doesn't play a role. So you just want to basically see, okay, can I get 8 turns out of this aircraft today? And that's what they do, because then you have 8 revenue opportunities. So I was looking at some just data of where are the aircraft and where are the people, and it's interesting to see that countries that will have a lot more aviation going forward. I mean, if you look at the fleet orders out of India with Indigo and with Air India, Indigo is now only starting to launch long-haul flying with wet-leased aircraft from North, first from Turkish and now from North Atlantic. But India, compared to China, for instance, India only has 65 wide bodies, which for a country of 1.4 billion is incredible. China, which is developed further, so China, which GDP is probably 2.5 times higher, GDP per capita 2.5 times higher than India, has 600 wide-body aircraft. So there is a very clear correlation between GDP per capita, because you can only fly with discretionary income or with money that you have left over. Clearly, India is now at the stage where the middle class is growing so fast that the demand for air travel is going through the roof. And it means that there's a lot.
And we touched on this in the context of what's the world going to look like in 2050. Remco, it sort of hit me with these stats. We said, look, we've got to add this to the podcast because it's such an interesting dynamic. I mean, India basically has got 65 wide bodies. Kaboom. What do you do with all that?
And even
that
Indonesia, same. I mean, Indonesia is growing 300 million people. That's probably has a GDP per capita that's higher than India. So the demand for aircraft is tremendous. I mean, the backlog that Airbus has is like 8,000 aircraft. Boeing has close to 6,000. A lot of them narrow bodies, but to connect basically these developing economies, there's no flights between Brazil and Nigeria. There's no flights. There's only 42 flights allowed under the air service agreement between India and China, which is, how is that even possible? And of course, there's not a lot of historical ties, but you would expect that this to grow tremendously in the years to come. And I think also one of the success factors that have come out of the Middle East, for the Middle East airlines, is of course the fact that they sit in the middle of these traffic flows where there's tremendous demand. India on one side, you have Saudi, and Saudi is now trying to pick some of that stuff back themselves by launching Riyadh Air. But a country like Nigeria has 3 wide-body aircraft.
So there we are. Teaser for next time. Remco and I are going to explore, in fact, Remco is, and I'll listen, what the world's going to look like in 2050, where we're sitting at the moment with that massive pent-up demand that doesn't have the capacity yet online. Stay tuned. It's going to be an interesting podcast. There we are, folks. You've had the Remco Althuis brief guide to running an airline. So, Remco, fascinating and very enlightening. Thank you very much indeed. We'll see you soon on another Just Great People podcast from the Success Consultancy.
Thank you, Barry. I appreciate it and enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. Many thanks for listening to our Just Great People podcast. And you can really help us. Please do remember to like and subscribe, and please share this podcast with everybody you know. We'd really appreciate it. Thank you. So that's it for today's Just Great People podcast from the Success Consultancy. We hope and trust you've enjoyed it. Please join us next time, and please do remember to subscribe. Thanks for joining us.